In the last couple of years or so, groups like Sunrise Movement, Extinction Rebellion, Fridays for Future and Zero Hour, led predominantly by young activists like Greta Thunberg and Varshini Prakash, have helped get the issues of climate change and overconsumption firmly embedded in the mainstream consciousness. April the 22nd, 2020 was the 50th anniversary of the first ever Earth Day, and to mark the occasion, a filmmaker called Jeff Gibbs, aided by his longtime colleague and friend Michael Moore, released a documentary movie on YouTube called Planet of the Humans. The programme contains a great deal of outdated, inaccurate and misleading information, so I thought it might be worth reviewing the film to consider the various challenges the filmmakers present. Hello and welcome to Just Have a Think. Right, so here's the film then. It starts out with a nice dramatic cinematic opening, followed by the writer and producer Jeff Gibbs telling us a bit about his earlier life and explaining how long he's been a proper environmentalist. After that, Jeff starts out his investigative odyssey with this question.
What better place to check out how our renewable energy revolution is coming along than a solar festival in the Green Mountain state of Vermont?
Well, the answer to that question, Jeff, is that a better place to check out how our renewable energy revolution is coming along is in the most recent data, which is freely available to anyone who wants to access it. We'll come to that data in a minute, but let's just have a think about Jeff's footage for a second. Jeff doesn't tell us when he was at this festival, but he shows us a few stalls that he visited while he was there, one of which was being run by this guy. He's called Roy Butler. Over the course of 23 years, Roy and his teams grafted in all weathers to install a total of 800 wind and solar energy systems for domestic and commercial customers in the northeastern states of America. I asked Roy what year the footage was taken from, and he confirmed it was from back in 2005, 15 years ago. Roy told me that the festival was in its infancy back then and they didn't really have two dimes to rub together. The very small solar installation at the event had been kindly donated by local companies to give the organisers a starting point from which they could build up their solar power system in future years. Jeff didn't know any of that, of course, because Jeff didn't ask. And because back in 2005 the event didn't have any battery storage, when rain began to dampen the event, the organisers had to switch to a backup generator and eventually plug into the mains. And Jeff was disappointed.
That was disappointing.
For the record, Roy tells me that over the next few years the festival's solar power system did grow tremendously and did power the event both in real time and with offset credits generated throughout the rest of the year. So what about that data I promised you then? Well, according to the latest figures from the International Renewable Energy Agency, or IRENA, between 2010 and 2018 the average global cost of electricity from solar photovoltaics fell by 77% to $58.7 per megawatt hour, or about 6 cents per unit in language that you and I would recognise in our household electrical systems, while the cost of electricity from onshore wind went down by 36% to $47 per megawatt hour, or about 5 cents a unit. Solar and wind have now become the cheapest source of electricity generation in nearly all major economies in the world, including India and China. In 2010, renewables made up about 8.6% of the global energy mix. That increased to 12.9% by 2018, and before the global pandemic hit us, renewables were expected to reach 22.5% by this year. Links to that data are in the description box below. Anyway, let's scoot back to a decade ago and catch up with how Jeff's getting on. One of the central themes of Jeff's film is his assertion that the environmental groups have been so thoroughly infiltrated by corporate money and sponsorship that the entire environmental movement is now totally compromised and completely invalid. Jeff's main beef with the environmental groups appears to be focused on the Sierra Club and 350.org. Jeff shows us this event from 2011 when Michael Bloomberg donated $50 million to the Sierra Club for their Beyond Coal campaign. Now I realise that Mr. Bloomberg recently made a very embarrassing spectacle of himself over there in the United States when he thought he could buy the presidential nomination from the Democratic Party. So he could be forgiven for thinking he's just a rich egomaniac who believes that simply throwing money at things is the solution to any problem he comes up against. And he might be. I don't know the guy, so I can't really comment. And to be honest, the Sierra Club isn't particularly well known outside of North America either. I'm certainly not a member, nor do I have any vested interest in defending them. But just for thoroughness, Here's some of the things the Sierra Club has done with Bloomberg's money, as well as thousands of $10 and $20 donations from ordinary working people since 2011. And here's what they continue to campaign on in 2020. I'll say one thing for Jeff, he certainly keeps his video archives well organised. This next bit of footage is from 2010 at the launch of the Chevy Volt, GM's plug-in hybrid vehicle.
Right now the car is charging off of your grid?
Right. It would be charging off our grid, which is about 95% coal.
Which of course is one of the very favourite pieces of trite rhetoric that electric vehicle naysayers tended to mindlessly regurgitate all the time a decade or so ago when this footage was shot. But by March 2018, even with the new US administration doing its best to big up beautiful clean coal for electricity generation and promote cheap gasoline from shale oil, Forbes magazine conceded that charging an electric vehicle was far cleaner than driving on gasoline anywhere in America. Forbes explained that the new data published back then in 2018 showed that in every corner of the United States, driving an EV produces significantly fewer greenhouse gas emissions than cars powered only by gasoline, regardless of the local power mix. Today, an average EV on the road in the US has the same greenhouse gas emissions as a car getting 80 miles to the gallon, far greater than the average gas-powered car available for sale in the US, which managed only 24.7 mpg by 2016. And according to this February 2020 analysis, an average electric vehicle over here in the United Kingdom now achieves the equivalent of 132 mpg. I don't think you need to be a rocket scientist to realise that as the proportion of renewable energy sources on the electricity grid continues to increase, so that comparison continues to move relentlessly in the favour of electric vehicles. Anyway, back to Jeff's story. So the nice man from the Board of Water and Light that Jeff met at the 2010 Chevy Volt launch tells Jeff that they've got a solar park just down the street. And Jeff's straight in there to get the lowdown from this guy. Boy, he knew his numbers.
A little bit closer. We generate about 64,000 kilowatt hours a year. Our average customer uses about 6,000 kilowatt hours a year. 6,000 into 64 is just a little over 10. We can meet the...
Technology writer Keaton Joshi looked up the details of the Cedar Street solar array. It was a 150 kilowatt 824 panel farm in downtown Lansing built in 2008, which is pretty much a lifetime ago in solar development years. Joshi explains that efficiency gains in solar have been so rapid that by leaving the dates off his footage, Gibbs is very actively deceiving the audience. The site generates 64 megawatt hours a year, according to the spokesman. A more recent installation in the same area generates around 436 megawatt hours. Keaton Joshi suggests this is like doing a documentary on the uselessness of mobile phones, but only examining the Motorola Ultra Sleek. Jeff also points out the materials that go into making solar panels with the help of the film's co-producer, Ozzy Zayner. Ozzy explains how silicon metal is made, a material that's used extensively in the iron and steel making industries, and which is also used in the production of silicon for solar panels.
So you start with a very high quality quartz and a very high quality coal. And then you put those two together into an arc furnace and you melt them.
The quartz is then melted with coal in a large furnace at temperatures of up to 1,800 degrees.
So you need more coal to do that. So that's, I get another coal out. So that's when we melt these together, we get silicon metal and carbon dioxide. And the carbon dioxide just goes off and you got rid of the carbon, you're left with silicon metal.
So do we need to use materials and energy to make solar panels? Yes, we do, and that does have an impact on the planet. Capturing carbon dioxide from these sorts of industrial processes is a crucial improvement that we need to see implemented quickly, and in fact the technology to do that is already in development in many parts of the world. But as climate activist Kathy Cowan-Becker points out in her recent article, once you build a solar panel or a wind turbine, nothing else has to be done. It'll operate for at least 20 years, creating electricity from the free and continuous resources of the sun and the wind. You don't have to continually dig up and feed those generation units with yet more natural resources to get them to produce power. Not so with fossil fuels, says Kathy. Energy generation units like coal plants, nuclear plants, or even your internal combustion engine car must continually be fed with natural resources that must continually be drilled, mined, or fracked from the earth in order to produce power. There's an entire scientific field of research to calculate this. It's called life cycle analysis. This chart, produced by Zeke Housefather from the Breakthrough Institute, shows how that analysis stacks up for a selection of energy sources. The vertical axis on the left-hand side shows life cycle greenhouse gas emissions in grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilowatt hour of power generated. Across the bottom horizontal axis, you've got the various energy sources, starting with solar panels on the left, then concentrated solar power, which we'll come back to later, followed by wind power, then nuclear power, with natural gas and coal making up the two last options on the right-hand side. So without reading out every single number, I think you can clearly see that on a full life cycle basis, gas and coal are massively more impactful on our atmosphere than low or zero carbon technologies, even taking materials and production into account. Anyway, back in the film, Ozzy and Jeff go on a bit of a road trip together, and one of the places they visit is here at the site of the solar energy generating system in Daggett, California.
Then Ozzy and I discovered that the giant solar arrays had been razed to the ground.
Oh my God.
I mean, this was huge.
It suddenly dawned on me what we were looking at. A solar dead zone.
Keith and Joshy did a bit of digging on this one too, and it turns out that the site Jeff and Ozzy had visited had indeed been the home of SEGS 1, but that facility stopped generating around 2015 and was removed and replaced by a completely new facility called Sunray 2. Jeff and Ozzy must have visited the site after the old system had been removed and before the new system had been installed. What an unfortunate coincidence. Keith and Joshy informs us that the new Sunray 2 system has generated 74 gigawatt hours of energy since its installation in 2015-16. He also points out that the upgrade means no emissions on site, lower land use, no water for cooling, and a lower environmental impact. While they were in California, the pair also visited the Ivanpah concentrated solar power plant in the Mojave Desert. That's the type I mentioned in column 2 of that chart we looked at earlier. And Ozzy drops a bombshell.
This solar facility burns natural gas pretty much every morning in order to get started up.
How long do they have to burn it for?
Hours usually. This is the incoming natural gas.
What Jeff neglected to tell us is that this was one of the first CSPs ever built and that newer CSP plants don't use gas. Here's a similar but more modern example called the Crescent Dunes Solar Energy Facility in Nevada. This design uses molten salt to store energy produced during the day so that it can continue to run at night. But it's not just solar power that Jeff has his sights on. He goes after wind power too. He shows us some more old footage that he shot somewhere back around 2011 at what was then the construction site for the Kingdom Community Wind Project in the Lowell Mountains in Vermont. The residents of Lowell voted 342 to 114 in the spring of 2010 to support the project, but Jeff hooked up with some of the folks opposed to the construction of the wind turbines at the time.
Does anybody consider that this is mountaintop removal for wind instead of coal?
Yeah, and we've even had people say if you can do mountaintop removal in Kentucky and West Virginia for coal, then it's about time that the rest of the country shared in the mountaintop removal too. Is you've got to have a fossil fuel power plant backing it up and idling 100% of the time, because if you cycle up or cycle down as the demand on the wind comes through, then you actually generate a bigger carbon footprint than if you just ran it straight.
Here's some up-to-date facts from Greg Alvarez of the American Wind Energy Association. Grid operators have decades of experience managing these changes in supply and demand, and it's proven that sudden unexpected outages at large conventional power plants are more costly and difficult to manage than the gradual predictable changes in wind and solar output. Because of the balancing efforts grid operators undertake, it's simply untrue that fossil fuel reserves run around the clock for when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, as the documentary falsely claims. Right now, in 2020, grid-scale energy storage and smart meters are being rapidly implemented in electricity grids in Europe and many other parts of the world to optimise the management, storage and distribution of renewable energy precisely when it's required, in precisely the location where it's needed. And just on that point about equating a farm to a mountaintop mining facility, here's what the Lowell Mountain project looked like after it was finished, and here's what a typical mountaintop mine looks like. Jeff and Ozzy are also keen to take on the big corporations and debunk the suggestion by some of them that they're transitioning their energy provision over to renewable energy technologies.
We never stop thinking about what's best for the planet. We now run Apple on 100% renewable energy. All of our facilities worldwide.
Elon Musk, the founder of Tesla, when he announced his Gigafactory battery plant, he said it would power itself with wind and solar energy. But in fact, it has lines connecting it to the same electrical grid that we're all connected to.
By showing us this footage, Jeff and Ozzy demonstrate that they either don't know or don't care how an electricity grid works. Tesla, and pretty much every other business with any kind of on-site renewable energy source for that matter, are all connected to the grid. That means they can export electricity when they're generating more than they need and import energy when they have a deficit. The method by which companies like Apple and Google get to their stated percentage of renewable energy is by looking at how much energy they consume and buying from the grid the same or some percentage quantity of energy sourced from renewables. As Keaton Joshi explains, these agreements, called Power Purchase Agreements or PPAs, have served an important purpose. Apple's main competitor, Google, is easily leading the entire tech industry in purchasing renewable energy. The grid is one big pool with buckets of energy in and out, Joshi explains. He says this is a revelation to the filmmakers, but a boring reality for anyone remotely familiar with the mechanics of electricity grids. But Jeff's real argument against renewables is that they don't actually displace fossil fuels at all. They just allow consumers to consume more energy. Jeff shows us this study and interviews the paper's author, Richard York, an environmental sociologist at the University of Oregon.
What we implicitly assume often, the substitute pushes out the thing you wanted to substitute for. What you find is nations that add non-fossil energy sources do not seem to see a particular suppression of fossil fuel use.
That's pretty mind-blowing. We've got billions of dollars being spent, and green energy is not even replacing fossil fuels.
They don't even know that that's a question. Yes.
I thought I'd better take a look at Richard York's paper to make sure I understood him properly. Luckily, it's still available to purchase and download, so that's what I did. And here it is. It's exactly the same paper that Jeff shows us in the movie, except for some reason Jeff removed the date at the top of his version. Anyway, that date is March 18th, 2012, and here's some commentary from the paper's concluding paragraph. It is possible that non-fossil fuel energy sources could more substantially displace fossil fuel sources if they were deployed in a context where there were explicit policies aimed at reducing carbon emissions, such as in California, where there is a goal of dramatically reducing carbon emissions over the coming decades. The most effective strategy for curbing carbon emissions is likely to be one that aims not only to develop non-fossil fuel energy sources, but also to find a way to alter political and economic context so that fossil fuel energy is more easily displaced and to curtail the growth in energy consumption as much as possible. Amen to that, brother. While I was researching, I noticed that Richard York had released a much more recent 2019 paper with co-author Shannon Elizabeth Bell, which was also available to purchase and download, so I bought that one too. The basic thrust is similar, but by 2019 the authors had made an additional observation. In the past, nations, industries and publics were not trying to reduce the use of any particular source of energy, but they were rather simply seeking ways to provide more energy. In contrast, in recent years, a large share of the world has clearly acknowledged that global climate change is a serious threat to societies and that a sharp reduction in the use of fossil fuels is necessary to minimise the severity of climate change. In this distinct context, perhaps there are reasons for optimism that we will see an energy transition in the full sense of the word, where renewable energy sources actually come to replace fossil fuels. Almost a full 40 minutes of Jeff's movie is focused on what most climate action groups consider to be a genuinely valid criticism of global renewable energy policy, and that's the use of biomass to bolster the carbon reduction numbers towards national emissions reductions targets. Jeff quite rightly highlights the detrimental impact of sugarcane plantations grown solely for ethanol production in areas like the Amazon. and his criticism of the widespread harvesting of trees to burn as biomass in power plants to produce electricity is completely justified. Environmental groups have been campaigning against this practice for many years, and in fact I made a programme for this channel last year looking at the scandalous way that the UK and the European Union are sucking in timber from the United States to add biomass into their apparently low carbon energy mix. Jeff's animation is right on the money on this one, but Jeff could have highlighted the incredible efforts of courageous environmentalists like Mary Booth from the Partnership for Policy Integrity. That organisation, in conjunction with other groups, has actually filed a lawsuit with the European General Court in Luxembourg, contending that including forest biomass as a source of renewable energy in the European Union's 2018 revised Renewable Energy Directive is incompatible with the environmental objectives of the EU, which include preserving, protecting and improving the quality of the environment, protecting human health, prudent and rational utilisation of natural resources, promoting measures at international level to deal with regional or worldwide environmental problems, and in particular, combating climate change. As a result of pressure from groups like the PFPI, internal discussions are being held within the European Union, and in fact the EU's own team of advisors, the European Academy's Science Advisory Council, warned the then President Jean-Claude Juncker in January 2018 that the legal mandate to record forest biomass-fired energy as contributing to the EU's renewable energy targets has had the perverse effect of creating a demand for trees to be felled in Europe or elsewhere in order to burn them for energy, thus releasing the carbon into the atmosphere, which would otherwise stay locked up in the forest, and simultaneously drastically reducing the carbon sink strength of the forest ecosystems. But rather than identify this crucial work by pressure groups, Jeff chooses to go after Bill McKibben of 350.org because McKibben was apparently misguided enough to endorse biomass over a decade ago before the facts had properly been explored. The implication being that McKibben and his organisation had been corrupted and bought out by the corporate infiltration, making him complicit in the deception. Since that time, as McKibben points out in his response statement to the film, he has been vocally opposed to biomass, campaigning on the issue and writing several articles on the subject. When the movie was first screened last year, McKibben wrote to the filmmakers to clarify his views. They didn't write back. As McKibben puts it, that seems like bad journalism and bad faith. Kathy Cowan-Becker comments on this in her article. She says, the insinuation that McKibben takes corporate money is ludicrous. The annual reports of 350.org show they get a little over half of their funding from individual donations and a little under half from foundations and grants. This is very common in the non-profit sector. Jeff takes a similar swipe at the Sierra Club, showing us a $3 million donation they apparently received from a timber merchant back in 2012, and arguing that they have donations on their annual financial reports from all sorts of undesirable corporations. I suspect the Sierra Club might need to respond to this challenge from Gibbs, but they're big boys and girls and I'm sure they can speak for themselves. In fact, they've already released this preliminary statement on their website. What Jeff is really attempting to emphasise in this movie, though, is the fact that we humans are simply plundering all of the Earth's resources in a completely unsustainable way. The film includes sound bites from a selection of middle-aged, middle-class, first-world white folks who've concluded that the real problem is that there are just too many people on the planet.
There are too many human beings using too much, too fast.
As a global community, we really have got to start dealing with the issue of population.
Population growth continues to be not the elephant, the herd of elephants in the room.
Can a single species that's come to dominate an entire planet
be smart enough to voluntarily limit its own presence?
I don't think any environmental group would disagree with the point about overconsumption, but inferring that overpopulation is the key cause of the problem is an extremely dangerous diversion that the fossil fuel industry and corporate marketers will regard as manna from heaven for their propaganda machines. I'm not exactly sure which people the interviewees think should be eradicated from our global numbers, but judging by this chart of agricultural land use from the website Our World in Data, it certainly isn't anyone in the developing world. If the whole world adopted the diet of India, for example, we could feed the entire human species using only 22% of the available habitable land on our planet. But if everyone adopted the diet of the United States, where all of Jeff's interviewees were apparently from, then we'd need an area of agricultural land equivalent to nearly 140% of the total available habitable land on Earth just to grow the food. And it's the same story with carbon dioxide emissions. The areas of the world where fertility rates are still above 4 children per woman, which is basically Africa, according to this map, are the exact same areas that have the lowest CO2 emissions relative to gross domestic product or GDP per person, as this final chart shows us. But in keeping with the rest of the points Jeff makes in this film, he offers absolutely no answers or solutions here whatsoever. Instead, Jeff ends his movie with several minutes of footage showing orangutans being burnt and chopped out of their indigenous forests. These forests are in Indonesia and they're being cleared to make way for palm oil plantations. Palm oil is in almost everything we consume, from cosmetics to food and almost everything in between. This channel published a video about palm oil back in 2018. There is absolutely no question the deforestation and loss of habitat that palm oil plantations are causing is nothing short of a modern day tragedy. But it's extremely disingenuous to imply that this was somehow brought about by collusion between corporations and environmental activist groups. And by the way, the use of palm oil is not inevitable or essential. This supermarket chain in the United Kingdom has already banned palm oil from every single one of its own brand products. And it took that stance in conjunction with Greenpeace. So that would be a commercial organisation working with an environmental group to bring about real change. Environmental activists all over the world are highlighting genuine solutions, behavioural changes and technologies for climate mitigation all the time. Project Drawdown is just one example. This book contains more than 100 upcoming and ongoing projects, large and small, that are right now helping to transform the way we use our resources. And despite Jeff's assertions in the film, environmentalists are not solely focused on renewable technologies for the answers either. Rewilding, reforestation and regenerative agriculture are all movements that are growing fast, and you can find out about all of them very easily if you just take the time to look them up. Books like this one by Albert Bates and Kathleen Draper educate us on how to work with the land instead of against it, and others like this Citizen's Guide to Climate Success by Mark Jacquard show each and every one of us how we can play our part in climate mitigation and long-term sustainability. There are no solutions offered in this film, not a single one. I think it's extremely unlikely that Jeff will be watching this programme, but just on the off chance that you are, Jeff, you have got every right to raise the issues of corporate greed and first world overconsumption. In fact, a robust debate about those challenges is a completely valid and extremely important thing to do. And I really do believe that's essentially where you're coming from. But in the planet of the humans, you got loads of things wrong in a movie backed by Michael Moore that's been watched by millions of people, many of whom are genuinely frightened about their future. And that's rubbish, man. That's really rubbish. In this film, you've distorted information in pursuit of what you regard as an overarching message. When your message becomes the most important thing and the facts are manipulated to suit that message, you're not really any better than the corporations that you criticise. Your film disrespects and undermines the efforts of thousands of genuine campaigners over many decades, and your nihilistic, staggeringly self-indulgent and completely solutionless narrative risks removing any last vestiges of hope from the minds of the very people you apparently want to energise. And your film may have just taken the cause of environmental activism back to where your footage started from, which is about a decade back in time. To everyone else, please don't simply accept everything this film says as gospel, and certainly don't take everything I've said today on face value either. Go and do your own research and make your own properly informed decisions based on multiple sources of reliable and verifiable information. Above all, remember to just have a think.